Okay, we're going to do one on Halloween and All Hallows Eve, Samhain, Day of the Dead, All Saints Day, and the holiday we just commonly call Halloween. All kinds of pictures come to mind whenever you talk about Halloween. Surely the most depicted one that you can have is probably going to be the jack-o'-lantern, which you see some of in the picture here, but also witches are known, and then ghosts also. And so you have an idea of this shamanistic witch type situation, that she knows magic and she knows the veil between the two worlds. And then a lot of the other things, especially in Elder Time, are all spirits, ghosts, demons, situations like this. Nowadays, people will dress up as Iron Man or somebody from Guardians of the Galaxy or from any of your favorite methods and modes and things. And one of the neatest things that I had saw right after Finding Nemo came out, and many people know that I was in a saltwater hobby quite well, and so Nemo and his anemone that he plays in, somebody took a bunch of the elongated type balloons that are a pinkish color, and he attached them to a shirt that he had, and so he basically looked like a giant anemone, and he got a clownfish suit for the baby where just the head poked out, and then it was Finding Nemo, and he would go around trick-or-treating for his kid. Of course, the kid was like 2, but and will never remember it, but gets shown the pictures quite often, and I'm sure the kid probably grew up watching Finding Nemo and so on. Anyhow, those are modern depictions, and in elder times there was different depictions. In fact, we'll talk about it, but the original pumpkin was actually a turnip and a squash for a time. And of course, a pumpkin is a type of squash, and it's more firm, you can do more with it type of things, but the original was a turnip, definitely. So as usual, I'm going to try to make some connections here. They make somewhat vague references in this article, and we'll put it all together. For this is really a time of harvest, a reaping, and many things were taken to this dating for specific reasons back in ancient times, up until just quite recently in this paganistic ritual, apparently paganistic, I put quotes on that, and it's still being very viable and part of American society. Just to give you a little background of me and something that I experienced, I'm in my 50s and stuff. I grew up a child of the 60s and so on, and I grew up, my father was in the Air Force, so I grew up in base housing and things, and in that world, there was definitely a lot more going on constantly as far as Halloween goes than in a lot of places. I.e., whenever my dad would go overseas and stuff, and TDY, and we would go back to where my mom lived and so on, that whenever we did this, it would be some little carnival type thing at the school, and if you trick-or-treated, you did it on your little street, and that's it, and everybody knew who the hell you were. Whereas whenever we did this just a few years later at base housing, we got to go the extent that we were ever allowed to go on our bikes. And quite often we would come back 2 different times on our trek because our bag got too full, and we would dump it out in each little piles, and this pile's mine, da da da, and then go out even again and keep going. And sure, some people gave out Rice Krispies treats and things like that and stuff, and sugar apples, candied apples, and things of that nature. Even had people that were giving out nickels back then, would giving out nickels, 1 to each kid. Amazing. God knows how many rolls of nickels he bought to end up making that happen. But people then would do a little bit of decoration, but not a lot. You had pumpkins, and it was real frequent. Sometimes people would have some banners, some streamers, some so on. And as I got older, right there, just in a 10-year period, I noticed a lot of people starting to make haunted houses, trying to dress up more at the door and things like that. And slowly but surely there came things that kind of look like this. And we used to do one and still do to this day at Halloween. It's kind of expected in the neighborhood here. This shows some kind of tunnelish walkthrough that's leading by some skeletons with corn and so on, and a lot of jack-o'-lanterns leading up to a witch that you would have to get the candy from and play the trick-or-treat game and end up getting it back. As we get into this, I'll discuss this trick-or-treat game and some of the different aspects and the way that folklore holds some of it to be still active today, actually, in what we have going on. Let's go ahead and get into the article, though. Crossing the Veil, the pre-Christian origins of Halloween and Samhain. Halloween, or the ancient Samhain, or Samhain, is considered a time of year when the veil between our world and the spirit world is at its thinnest. As darkness falls and families light their pumpkins or jack-o'-lanterns, they are perhaps unknowingly repeating the ancient traditions of honoring the dead and marking the beginning of the dark half of the year. For this is a seasonal thing, just like spring. And if we just look at spring's essence, we can kind of get the essence of the anti-spring that happens in fall or autumn. In spring, until that, through the winter, there has been more darkness on the northern continents, northern hemisphere, more darkness than there has been light throughout the day. And at the point we reach Easter, we start having equal and then more light all the way through summer till fall and its apex, and then darkness overtakes light. And they're a little bit off on the date here, but not much. But that off on the date also signifies other things. For it's amazing how it goes with the Taurid Meteor Shower that happens right during the same time, during the same week. And the amazing thing that we found is there are 6 cultures basically all over Earth that were not connected in any way, that all contained a ritual that was extremely like this, and variations on a theme of like this, even in the New World. Before we got here, and the Day of the Dead is something that they recognized as Spanish sailors and so on. That these people already had something that was like our Day of the Dead, which is kind of like this Celtic ritual thing that goes on with Druids, which is kind of like All Saints' Day, which is kind of like the ritual that was over in Persia, which is kind of like some things that go on in India and other places, and it's just amazing. And I've showed you a bunch of times that idea of spring and the rites of spring are separated but still together in Sumeria, in Egypt, in ancient Canaanite rituals in the Bible, which is kind of hidden now, in all ancient Europe belief too, and Proto-Indo-Europeans too, and these sun-worshipping people that all connected at one time, way, way back when. Let's continue on. Halloween is an annual celebration that held largely in the Western world on October 31st, starting in the evening. Children and sometimes adults dress up in masks and costumes traditionally as ghostly figures, witches, or the undead, vampires, zombies, or skeletons. They go knocking door to door, requesting treats, or else threatening a mischievous trick upon the household. This is a little bit different than the way it used to be, and it got taken out of hand for a period of time, but let's continue. Typical activities of the modern observance can include costume parties, pumpkin carving, trick-or-treating, lighting bonfires, playing pranks as kids in a mischievous age, and more. There's always some type of ritual going on with it, but notice that the traditional thing are ghostly figures, witches, and undead. Honoring the dead itself, an idea of undead or rebirth, or that they did not die, and then this ritual lets that go. And I've done other videos about, last year I did one about vampires, the year before I did one about zombies. I did one about skeletons also. I also did one about the idea of Frankenstein and where werewolves come from. And so we can try to look all those up at my site and everything. You can see the different tales and where they originally come from and ideals of each one. And I might even do a refresher this year on it. As we come into the holidays, I like to do this. And through Thanksgiving and into Christmas, I do a lot of them that have to do with that. I've even done a 12 days of Christmas situation, but last year I only did 5. Once I got to 5 golden rings, I let it go, and then I did one at the 12th. But regardless of that, Halloween is a shortened form of All Hallows Eve, an echoing of the Celtic harvest festivals of pre-Christian Europe. It's observed now in several countries around the world as it is spread through, Americanization and other forms. It is the evening before All Hallows Day, though, which is when saint or hallows or martyrs are remembered in people of many Christian denominations. So it seems that the Day of the Dead is really about demons and crazy crap, and the following day is all about saints and remembrance of those. But it actually isn't. It all connects. And this idea of demons and things, well, I'll get into that shortly. But this ritual coincides with, and some scholars suggest co-opted, the ancient observance of Samhain or Samhain. Samhain, pronounced Samhain, in traditional Celtic festival markings of the seasons and approach of the winter. Wikipedia describes this pre-Christian custom. Many important events in Irish mythology happen or begin on Samhain. And I could start to go into a series of those, but that would just make this thing a multi-parter. I might do one on separate. Yeah. It was the time when cattle were brought back down from the summer pastures and when livestock were slaughtered for the winter. As it started to become, and there was going to be some snows coming and things like that, where they had taken the cows to pasture, they would bring them back. And I made reference to this in a cowboy video that I talked about here recently, but funny how things have little connections all over. As at Beltane, special bonfires were lit, and people still have these series today where they'll build incredibly huge bonfires and light them as being, even though it's falling to darkness, it would be a beacon or a light for the earth, like a lighthouse. And a lot of times these ancient lighthouses that you saw that would have, of course at the time, not electricity, but would light a fire and to signify that people are coming or something bad's happening, and then they would connect, like in Lord of the Rings where you see them connect on the mountaintops from a distance and so on. And this thing would be done during that time and reset again. These were deemed to have protective and cleansing powers and were rituals involving them. Samhain, like Beltane, was seen as a liminal line when the spirits or fairies, the Osi, could more easily come into our world, that you could make connections with your past, that anybody that had died in the last year was going to be deified at this point. That these ancient bonfires and some sparks in some essence were taking that soul up into heaven, and because of it being the sparks, that person was in some religious circles deemed to have become a star, to shine down upon the earth for generations to come. Fires and later candles were lit to mimic the sun and hold back the dark from the oncoming winter. And here's just one ritual of a smaller bonfire that's set in the middle of a sacred grove. When I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts, and there was this sacred Order of the Tap Out for the Order of the Arrow, and it's an ancient Indian ritual which usually takes place at this same type of event, and Sometimes they would even honor it in spring or in fall, and that would be just about it. But it got changed to end up being the end of the summer jamboree that you would be involved with when school wasn't in, and got deviated to that. But it too involved a bonfire and a ritual, and snakes, and honoring the dead in situations, and a coming of age, and the idea of being a warrior, and a lot of other things that kind of go with this. Now, dead and departed relatives played a central role in the tradition, as a connection between the living and the dead was believed as stronger at Samhain, or there was this connection, and there was a chance to communicate. We can see this sometimes in the idea of a Ouija board being involved, and all these things, ghost stories and stuff like that that you can remember. Souls of the deceased were thought to return to their homes. Feasts were held and places were set at tables as a way to welcome them home. And there used to be a ritual if someone had died in the year that they would give them the head of the table or their place that they always had set at, and they would go ahead and place it for that person too. That they wouldn't do that throughout the year, and this would be too much sorrow and things and to try to do and everything, but we would honor it at this point and then try to let it go, especially if it was one of your children that had passed away, or if the children were honoring a parent, or if a children and a parent were honoring their grandparent and parents. So ancestor veneration held a large portion of this, and in the circle of life and the circle of a year, and the time in a small season and a big season, and a time whenever people go through their springtime into their summer of life and into their autumn and into their fall, into the silver years, and to be honored after the fact of what had happened. And some of that aspect has sadly started to fade from us also, and I'm not calling for people at Halloween to start remembering grandma so much necessarily, but it should be done in some way and more. Feasts were held though, and places were set for the dead. Food and drink was offered to the unpredictable spirits and fairies to ensure continual health and good fortune. But there's an ancient story that went with Dungeons and Dragons, and I talk about a lot of times how they have all these stories back in, and it comes from an ancient mythical tale where what had happened was too many demons were released upon the earth. And demons were the old spirits of angry and trapped souls. And so this is the idea of wraiths and spirits and things like that that usually are not beneficial in any way, and that they would have to appease them. So during this festival, people would dress up and mock them, and then the people in general would give to them and waste like a sacrifice, and do it with animals too, but there was a sacrifice of the most precious of things. And while that might have been cattle or something like that at some times, and quite often it would have been sweets like honey and sugar and things along that nature, and especially nuts and so on, these things that would subsist you through winter, and you're fixing to face it, and for some reason you give up some of it right at the very start of it to protect yourself from these demons trying to cause their wrath through their dark side of the year, right? The yin and yang of life. And so it's a way, some appeasement. And we still do this today whenever kids come to us dressed up as demons, and they threaten us, and we give them candy to appease them, and they don't wrap our house with toilet paper. But in the old day, the thought was never that someone was going to wrap your house with toilet paper, but you would perhaps incur the wrath of those that had gone before. Interesting how it all connects, but the old story in D&D was that they had trapped all the demons inside of there, and that we have to keep doing this year after year, for if we fail and if we drop Halloween, they will be leased upon the earth again like Pandora's box. that it took thousands of years to make a ritual enough, strong enough that they could do this. And through a process of trickery involving Loki and a few other situations, they got them to come so they would be deified. In the ritual, it was a trick and a trap. And then they were trapped into the other realm and only be able to be spoken to. And they saved us all from the demons of the earth. But we still have to appease them at this time and mock this per year, for they said this was part of the ritual, with that they were going to be deified and all these things, and they said, oh, okay, and they agreed to it. And though in reality it was a one-time thing and forever after that, trapping them in this situation, as long as we honor it, we honor our portion of the deal, and they have to honor their portion of the deal. That's just one strange aspect or branch off of this idea, though. But it continues good health and good fortune and avoids the bad things in life. The idea that souls return home on a certain day of the year is repeated across many cultures around the world. Dia de Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, is a similar holiday in Mexico, but in Spain and ancient Aztecs too, celebrating and honoring family members who had died. And they do it a little different, and they paint up skull masks and things, and this goes with rituals that go way back, whatever. They did painting of skulls, and they did ritual art with the skull in the home after the time of death, and would put the fake death mask on them and try to bring them back to life for this ritual, and then let them go into the afterlife. And it's believed that whenever they still had the flesh upon the bone, that there was still a portion of them here, and their soul could go through these things. And so that's one reason why they use sarcophaguses. For a sarcophagus, in its actual essence of name, comes out to be flesh eater. Phagus is eater, and sarco would be the flesh of man. And so they want this ritual to go on where the flesh gets eaten away and taken to heaven, and now what's left is just the shell of the man. But no, it's not the shell, for it's the inner part of it. It's the bone, what is left of bone. There's an old ritual that talks about how flesh is God's and bone is what's left of ours. And I think that relates exactly to the idea of a decaying body and so on. Now, this similar date, and it celebrates by the dead or the past people. Sorry. Similarly, this falls on October 31st and November 1st and 2nd, and also this runs through the same dating system. And again, I tell you, it has to do with the same dating system of the Taurid Meteor Shower, and perhaps that there was a bunch of people that died whenever something like that Taurid Meteor Shower happened, but there was a big one that happened. And it looks like at the end of the last ice age with the Younger Dryas event, it may coincide with it. Ironically, the comet that is expressed as being exploded itself and be a remnant that we run through each time of year, through actually spring and fall, we run through this debris field that's there. It's a comet Inky. And when we run through this debris field, we just run through castings, almost like when you're driving and you run through a series of bugs and they hit the windshield or something like that. And so we go through this splattering, but most of these objects are baseball, football size, a little bigger, and some of them can get car-sized, and a remnant will actually make it to the earth. But it's believed that in ancient times, some of that largest chunk of that remnant, and every once in a while still, we run through larger chunks of that remnant. So you can see things like the explosion that happened over in Russia in an airburst and stuff, which happened during that time of the year, or this time of the year. You'll see this happen more often. Not that that's all where, asteroids come from and our impacts that we have, but something to be concerned about a little bit, but not concerned to the point that oh my gosh, we're going to die. Let's not freak out. But at the same point, I always make the point that if we don't pay attention to that, we're not going to see the baseball we're running into. Just like a car accident, sometimes it happens too fast and a deer runs right out in front of us. Right. And I don't want to be the deer caught in the headlights if it ever happens to us, so we need to pay more attention to that. But that's about enough on that. Let's go back to Halloween. Trick or treat. Samhain saw a metamorphosis due to early church. In the history of Halloween or Samhain, Jack Centineo writes, as a result of their efforts to wipe out pagan holidays such as Samhain, the Christians succeeded in effecting major transformations in it. In 601 AD, Pope Gregory I issued a now famous edict to his missionaries concerning the native beliefs and customs of the people he hoped to convert. Rather than try to obliterate the native customs and belief, which would be hard-pressed and would cause them angst and everything, the Pope instructed his missionaries to use them. If a group of people worshipped a tree, rather than cut it down, he advised them to consecrate it to Christ and allow its continued worship. And we've talked about this statement in Celtic tree worship, the yew tree, the sacred oak, and things that are all looked through. But tree worship is all the way back to Sumerians, and where they had evergreen trees during the winter and their sacred cedar forests that are also seen in Egypt, talking about it in Lebanon, and the Lebanon cedar forest and everything. And it makes a connective to where there's ancient belief systems of tree worship going on in all the places. Even in your Bible, there are olive trees that are talked about and so on. And it all works out, that it is all connected. In the 12th century, holy days of obligation across Europe involved town criers dressed in all black, ringing mournful bells and calling on Christians to remember the poor souls of the dead. Special soul cakes would be baked and shared, and this led to a series of things that over time led to fruit cakes. And yeah, I even did a short one, well, short, about 15 minutes long, about fruitcakes and where that came from. And damn, some of them were even that old. And the joke is, yeah, this one fruitcake has been passed around since the first fruitcake. Year after year, they kind of don't go bad and so on, but they can eventually ferment out, and they have alcohol attached to the idea too, and so that helps it. But let's continue. The custom of souling was shared in England, Germany, Belgium, Austria, and Italy, and remnants of such activities all the way in the Middle East. And it's thought to be the early precursors of trick-or-treating, that during a time of harvest, whenever that harvest happened, that the first thing that you would do was give some of that as a sacrifice. And it's in the Bible. It's in Sumerians, it's in many people's tales, that they would, whenever they made the first bread, there's an ancient tale of whenever they made the first bread, that the very first loaf after baking would be given to the gods and just wasted away. And you think, what are you doing? And because God gave the abundance, we had to feed him. You see, we still had this idea, even though he's an immortal God, that he has human characteristics and would need something like that, or would enjoy the smell of burnt beef like it talks about in the Bible. Interestingly, they say whenever you go to space, it smells like a burnt barbecue. But this souling or trick-or-treating, oops, his knee hurts. Eventually, mumming and guising. And this is dressing up and going door to door, disguised and performing in exchange for food. Kind of like Christmas caroling, a little different, right? And you'd have this little skits and ham up things. This is a way that actually led into haunted houses too, for some of these little troops would go around and do certain houses where they were having parties at, and they would show up at their party as a party buster and put on their little show, and you're expected to hook them up with a party, and then they go on, and they probably do this 2 or 3 times and so on, and have a night of mischief perhaps too. Pranks were a way of confounding evil spirits too. Pranks at Samhain date far as back as 1736 in Scotland and Ireland, and I tell you, it goes back to its origins. And this led to Samhain being dubbed Mischief Night, but Mischief Night's a different thing, where rebel rousers and kids would cause problems, and people that didn't give them candy and so on would get in trouble by the kids. And there's your demons acting upon you because you didn't do the thing. Well, still to this day, if they don't have their lights on, you don't knock. You don't know what it is. That could be a grandparents, and it's too hard for them to get up and down every single one. And sometimes they just set out a bowl, but these kids nowadays will take the whole bowl and dump it and not even just grab a piece or two. So there comes a problem with doing that. I've had elders before give their candy, buy some candy and give it to their neighbors and go, here, give that out. And what is that? I'm appeasing the demons. Almost said in that exact guise, like, yeah, make sure the kids don't. Nowadays they don't wrap houses and do the crazy things that they used to do there for a little while, but it's gone through waves. In the early 1900s, we definitely did, and it almost ended Halloween. Yeah, it almost ended Halloween. And finding out about that when I was young, and then the story about how you can't end Halloween because it would cause the world to go crazy and chaos, that, you know, that ensured the fact that I liked it a whole lot more. My sister's also born right around Halloween, and so we always had parties and stuff like this. And my mom, she had sleepovers on the weekend and wow, did I lose it? She had sleepovers on the weekend of it, and quite often, and we would do something extra. She would get a cake, but it was devil's food cake usually, or chocolate cake, or something along that line. And we also had some ornaments that we put out in the middle of the table that right up until then was started to have a fall look. It was put just for a week or two, or maybe at the most, and then this thing was a witch that was made of the crepe paper that stayed flat for all the year, but then you spun it out like when you open up a book and they have the pop-ups and that side of thing, and also it had stuff that stuck on into it that turned it all into a witch, and really it looked like a Broomhilda type thing. And my mom had this thing that it's just endears. It was nothing more than a yellow moon about the size of not a basketball but smaller, volleyball probably, and there was a couple of bats on it and a witch made out of black paper, construction paper, on yellow background moon, and that's all it was. But you would put that in the front window and stuff, and it looked so perfect, and of course Scooby-Doo and all those things when I was growing up as a kid, and it all just fit together. Many of the modern practices for Halloween date to the 19th century England and North America. Fortune telling and divination played part in these celebrations, and again I talk about the Ouija board and things that came. Games were played intending to divine one's future. Nuts and fruits featured in the editing and drinking or eating and drinking games, and you have bobbing of apples and so on. And soul cakes were prepared, and these were marked with a B for baby and me. For Halloween, pumpkins are hollowed out and spooky faces are carved into them, creating jack-o'-lanterns. And why Jack? Well, I'll get to that. Jack was a mischievous one, and Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick, and that has to do with this too. And jumping over light. And candles are then lit though and put inside of pumpkins, creating eerie lanterns, serving as signals or beacons that a household observes Halloween. And so if you see somebody with these pumpkins out front, kids can go for candy. And you can literally see them have it figured out where, oh, there's no light on there, but they got pumpkins, and run across the street. Be real careful on Halloween with children running around like this. There's always an accident or two over North America, and there's so much that goes on that it's amazing there's not more than that, but be careful. Pumpkins are frequently used today as they are easier to carve and a symbol of harvest time, so it just works all with this idea. But the original lanterns in Ireland and Scotland were carved from turnips. These turnip lanterns were used to frighten off evil spirits by geysers, and were a motive of the Irish Christian folk tale of Jack. Jack was a wandering soul who was denied entry into both heaven and hell. He had to be appeased, and he was a demonish type thing, and blamed like, oh, He's blamed for just anything that happens and stuff. He's one of those things that gets it put on him. Here's an ancient depiction of a turnip type pumpkin. And strangely enough, when I first saw the first ones of these, it envisioned to me the idea of a mummy. And I think you can see the mummy face in it, everything. For it was maybe even supposed to have been more just a skull in the Day of the Dead type of thing, and the recessed, sunk-in eyes. But if it's hollowed out enough and you set the little candle inside of it, it glows out the eyes. And now instead of a regular lantern, you have a scary lantern. Observing Halloween is not without controversy even in a modern day. I remember when I was a kid, there was this thing that's totally turned out to be fake, but that people were putting needles inside of candy bars and all these things, and that you shouldn't accept the stuff that's handmade by people. There was this lady in our neighborhood that made handmade divinity fudge. And she gave you a chunk that was about the size of a playing card. Yeah, of this stuff. I don't know how many trays of divinity she made, but she was damn good at it. Kids love that. And you know, funny, we didn't exploit that. We would go back if we could try to get a second off of it, but we didn't try to exploit that as much. This lady also didn't get her house wrapped, even during other times of the year. Some religions discourage participation in suggesting that it trivializes Samhain, or that it has satanic associations, or that it's inappropriate tribute to paganism or the occult, or that what you're actually doing is appeasing demons, and there's no way that you should be doing that in a Christ thing. You should stand around with a cross and do things like that. But actually where this all comes from is connected. And it's probably going to go on for many, many, many more generations. It's gotten to be quite the thing here in America. And then, it boosted up by candy companies, and even boosted up by companies now that want their products sold in there, and they want you to look like Iron Man and so on, and they get a cut. All these things help out the fact of it getting procured and continuing. However, the modern practice is heavily influenced by commercialization, as I'm talking about, and popular culture differ appreciably from the ancient traditions of when Samhain and All Hallows Eve, the Day of the Dead. Still, the connection exists, and the history is clear. When you light a jack-o'-lantern and brighten the darkening season, you're carrying on an age-old tradition that bridges cultures around the world and reaffirms our connection to our departed loved ones. And that's just a little bit about Halloween history. That kind of looks like Scooby-Doo, or kind of like the moon of my mom's, but it only had two smaller bats and a witch flying across this way. Anyhow, guys, I could go on and on and on, and I may do another separate related one that'll have to do with more connections, but there's a lot of them in that video right there. Happy Halloween. Enjoy the holidays, and let's enjoy coming through Thanksgiving, which is a reaping and a enjoying of that harvest, and a strengthening of our bodies to make it through the winter, which used to, in old times like this, especially if it was a bad one, could actually take out people and cause large problems. Thank us all for now that not having happened anymore. Happy Halloween. Enjoy. Peace.